Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eyecare Today. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas Kislan, and just to remind everyone, we're coming to you from our Hazleton location. It's on the Airport Beltway in Hazleton, and if there's any questions ever, please feel free to contact us. Our phone number is 453-2020, and if you're watching in the Stroudsburg area, our Stroudsburg office is Stroudsburg Eye Specialists, 852 North 9th Street in Stroudsburg. The phone number is there is 421-334-3342, and as always, you can look us up on the web at www.drkislan.com. We have an exciting show today, folks. We're very happy to be joined by Dr. Michael Gross. He's the Chief Medical Officer for Physician Recommended Nutraceuticals. And we haven't done a show in a while, folks, about omega-3 science. And there's been a lot that's been happening in the world and in the world of omega-3s and nutrition as far as omega-3s. And you've heard me talk about this subject before, and I just wanted to review some things and present some new data. And so we're very fortunate and happy to have Dr. Gross with us. So Mike, thanks for coming all the way up from Philadelphia and joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Tom. It's always great to be back in Hazleton and say hello to all my friends in this region.
And you do have a lot of friends here. I mean, this is probably one of the biggest areas for some original PRN sales, right? I mean, for some reason, Hazleton seemed to take off in this area.
Well, perhaps that's a reflection of how smart the people are in Hazleton, but we actually did almost launch our business here in this region.
Right, and I know Sam Lasan Sr. had a lot to do with that. He's a big believer in it and takes it himself, and we've heard his story a gazillion times about his cholesterol. But what I want to do today, folks, is really start from the beginning for review for those of you who maybe haven't heard this before. First of all, what are omega-3s, and how do they work, and why do we need them? So, Dr. Gross, tell us, what are omega-3s?
Well, before I get into too complicated an answer, it's an interesting time for us now, Tom, because we started this journey 5 or 6 years ago, and if you had asked that question to me, I think that most of the public would be scratching their heads, you know, what are omega-3s at all? Why are they even visiting the subject? Last year in America, omega-3 supplements passed multivitamins as the #1 supplement used by Americans. So it seems that the recognition of omega-3s and the value of omega-3s has resonated to the point where most Americans at least know that they're there and know that they have some value. But after that, it gets a little bit more confusing, especially about what omega-3 is best, how much should I take, what form should it be in. And I'm sure we'll get to that later in the discussion. For the moment, everyone should understand that omega-3s are essential fats. Now, what does that mean nutritionally? Anything that we preface with the word essential in nutrition means that it must be included in the diet. Why? Because it is crucial for health, and your body cannot make it or store it. So omega-3s are actually essential fats, and for years we used to think of fat as bad and so forth, but there's nothing in nature, there's nothing in nutrition that's bad if it's in the right form and if it's in balance. So the best way to answer the question is that this is an essential fat that's required for good health, and omega-3s are part of every cell. They comprise the structure of the cell membrane. They have everything to do with how the cell functions in terms of absorbing nutrients, absorbing oxygen, absorbing medicines. That's something we call cell membrane permeability. And if I wanted to distill it all down, I would say that the more omega-3s that you have in your cell membranes, the better they function.
So we know omega-3s are essential. But what happens if we don't have them? So what happens to our bodies? What's the key disease process maybe that happens in our body if we don't have omega-3s?
Well, I'll start again at the cell level and kind of work out. Because these essential fats must be in the cell membrane. If they're not there in the form of omega-3, they will be replaced by another form. most likely what is prevalent in the diet will be what shows up in the cell. So in this case, we're talking about the other essential fat, omega-6, which is in vegetable oils, fast food, saturated fats, processed foods, just about everything that we eat. And they replace the omega-3 on the cell membrane, but they have the opposite effect. They actually make the cell membrane less permeable, more inflexible, and that happens because omega-6s start the process of inflammation.
That's the buzzword nowadays,
That's
right?
the
I
word.
mean, in medicine, everything's about inflammation. And I think what's key for folks out there listening is to understand that we've got good omega-3s and we've got bad omega-3s. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if we have too much of the bad, or I should say bad omegas, omega-6s, if we have too much of those bad omega-6s, it pushes the inflammatory process in our bodies along, which can lead to cell death and all those bad things. So is that the right?
That's a great way to articulate it, Tom. And I think the folks out there should recognize that this is a balance, and omega-6s are essential because inflammation is required to start the healing process. But I'm sure the folks out there listening and watching are familiar with the notion for every action in nature there is an equal and opposite reaction. So when the inflammatory process starts, it starts the healing cascade, and then when that's over, something needs to turn it off. And that's what omega-3s do. They are anti-inflammatory. So if there's no switch off, the inflammatory process continues. Think of it as a fire that begins locally and then begins to spread to regional areas and then ultimately consumes the entire body. So this notion of inflammatory disease that you were referring to, Tom, has become an epidemic in America because so much of the food that we eat is pro-inflammatory.
So if we could sum up this first segment before we take our first break, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and omega-6s, which are found in a lot of the processed foods, fast foods, pizza, French fries, all those types of foods are pro-inflammatory. And they could actually make certain disease processes move along faster. Is that kind of in a nutshell?
Absolutely correct.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break, folks. When we come back, we're going to talk more omega-3s, what conditions they help. So you're watching Eyecare today. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks. You're watching Eyecare Today. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas Kislan, and again, we're joined today by Dr. Michael Gross. He's the Chief Medical Officer of Physician-Recommended Nutraceuticals, and what we're talking about today is the science behind omega-3s, how they work, what they do, why we need them, what diseases they can help. So again, thank you, Mike, for joining us today. As a quick reminder and a little plug, folks, this is actually part one of a two-part show. We're going to talk basically about omega-3 science in our first show, and in our second show, when we have Dr. Gross back, we're actually going to focus a little bit more on eye care and how omega-3s help the eyes. So be sure to tune next month to our second part show. So before the break, Mike, to sum it up, omega-3s, anti-inflammatory. When we have certain conditions, heart disease, cholesterol, high cholesterol, dry eye, arthritis, dry skin, those are all conditions that are inflammatory in nature. So omega-3s being anti-inflammatory can help some of these conditions. And omega-6s, which are the bad omega-3s, let's say, that we find in certain foods, fast foods, processed foods, those we actually have to watch how much of that we ingest. Explain now for the folks, because this is, you made a statement in the first segment that omega-3 sales have passed multivitamin sales in the United States. So that means that folks are going out and they're going to Walmart or Costco or CVS and they're seeing the Mongo bottle of omega-3s that costs $9 and you get 6,000 pills, right? So that's what a lot of people, and they're taking like 1 a day, 2 a day. Aunt Jenny says take 3 a day, and their neighbor says take 4 a day. So people really are taking omega-3s because they know they're good. But I think where we need guidance is on what form the omega-3 should be in and really how much we should take. So maybe if you could sum up for us the science behind how omega-3s are produced and the difference between what we find just over the counter at CVS for $8 versus the physician-recommended brand, what the differences are.
Well, Tom, you've brought up an interesting question because it's interesting that physicians are now recommending patients go out and get omega-3s. Whatever specialty physician we're talking about, in fact, interestingly, last year, cardiologists were the most likely ones to recommend an omega-3 supplement, but more along the lines of, you need an omega-3, go out and find it. So our initial focus with physician-recommended nutraceuticals, since we rely on the physician to make the recommendation, was to help the physicians understand what forms of omega-3 are best, what dosages are best. Certainly, if they believe that our products are the best, they recommend those because it's really something that is equivalent in terms of benefit to a pharmaceutical agent. And the doctors are starting to get it now. These are the kinds of things that we don't learn in medical school. I actually had to go back and get some additional graduate training myself. So here we've got physicians understanding that inflammation is part of everything they treat. The cardiologists have vasculitis, and the orthopods have arthritis, and the eye doctors have blepharitis. They've all got their form of itis, which is a reflection of inflammation. They know they have to treat it, and they know that omega-3s have tremendous benefit in this regard. So what we're trying to do now is get to the second stage of the learning curve. All right, omega-3s are good. I need to have them to counteract all the inflammatory influences in the American diet. Well, what's best and in what form? Well, all of the data tell us, and this is epidemiologic data, what that means, folks, is when we look at certain cultures around the world, who are the healthiest or who are the unhealthiest, it turns out that certain cultures like the Japanese have the least amount of inflammatory disease. And the reason for that, many people believe, is because of their high amount of fish consumption. That means that the omega-3 levels in those populations are very high, but that also means that the omega-3s must be in a food form or a fish form. This is a triglyceride form, and that's what people do not find in the Costco or the Walmart, in the GNC. In fact, they find the chemical byproducts of fish oil production as they're on their way to being purified. And these things can still be called fish oil. They're less expensive, but they basically have no benefit. In fact, you'd have to take hundreds of those a day, or at least dozens, to get any benefit. And if you took that many, there would be side effects associated with that.
So explain for me the process by which omega-3 is basically made, from the fish to what I take in a capsule form.
Well, of course, it starts with a fish. So,
what kind of fish?
Well, we'd like to hope that it's a clean fish. That seems to be one of the biggest issues now. Of course, Tom, you know, I started my career in obstetrics and gynecology, and we knew decades ago that fish consumption was good for pregnancy and good for babies, and we encouraged patients to eat fish, but the fish were cleaner back then. Now we're down to recommending 2 fish meals a week, because beyond that we've got contamination issues, mercury, PCBs, dioxins, and so forth. So everything starts with a fish. Out comes the oil when we press it. That oil is in a triglyceride form, but it has impurities in it, and it can be sold that way.
And that's the mercury, the dioxins, the PCBs.
Exactly.
Are in that form. So then, correct me if I'm wrong, at that point then is where you go through the distillation process, you remove all that, but to do that they have to add alcohol, ethyl alcohol.
That's right.
Right?
Well, interestingly, what people buy mostly over the counter, the really inexpensive brands, are the ones that are in this native oil form. They have not been purified, and there actually was a study recently that showed the top 10 leading over-the-counter sellers and brands of fish oil were hugely contaminated.
Even if it says mercury-free or
Even
purified.
if it says that.
Which is scary.
It's scary. This is not regulated, and it's very unfortunate.
So people think they're taking something purified, and they're really not.
They're not.
So how do we get past that then? Because isn't there a process then where you can remove all that garbage, all that ethyl alcohol, to get it back to the triglyceride form?
And that's what you were referring to just a bit ago, Tom. The process of distillation involves adding alcohol then to the unpurified oil, and that changes the boiling point and allows these impurities to be precipitated out. We all have these kinds of classes in high school chemistry, and that's fine as a second step in the process, but now we've changed the oil into a different chemical form. The oil is now an ethyl ester, and there are no ethyl ester fish in the ocean, so these things are difficult to process, to digest. They're not well absorbed. They might be a little bit more expensive than those native oils that I talked about, but they don't do any good. And what's even more unfortunate is that these forms of fish oil release alcohol as they are converted back to the food form in the body. Our body can only absorb these omega-3s in the form of food, that is the triglyceride form.
And is that what gives a lot of patients the burpy fishy taste, the upset stomach, and why they say, you know, I just can't take fish oil? Is that one of the reasons?
And when patients complain about that to you and to me, I always say, do you have the same reaction when you eat fish? And they say no.
Right.
So because they're not eating fish, they're eating a chemical. And interestingly, the course of action that many of these companies have taken is they'll cover the oil or surround it with a big thick capsule, what's called an enteric coating, which certainly prevents these gastrointestinal side effects, but it further reduces absorption. So once again, the public has been
bamboozled.
Bamboozled. That's the good word. They've been fooled into thinking that they're getting something good when they're not.
What I want to do is we're going to take another quick break here, folks. When we come back from the break, we're going to finish talking about the distillation process of omega-3s, and I want to touch on some major conditions that omega-3s can help, some systemic conditions. So make sure to come right back. You're watching Eyecare Today. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks. Again, you're watching Eyecare Today. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas Kislan, and we're going to get right back into it. Again, we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Michael Gross, the Chief Medical Officer of Physician-Recommended Nutraceuticals, with us. And before the break, we were talking about how omega-3s are made, what omega-3 is better, what we're getting over the counter, the distillation process. So, Dr. Gross, before we went to the break, we were at the point where a lot of the supplements we take over the counter through the distillation process. And let me just go back and review for the folks if they're just tuning in. We start with the fish, that we press out the oil, and that oil is what has all the mercury, the dioxins, the PCBs, all the bad stuff in it. Then chemicals have to be added to remove all that. So we're left with this oil that has all this ethyl alcohol and these chemicals in it, which is then what a lot of the over-the-counter supplements, and it's the form in which they're sold because it's cheap to do that. Correct. So a lot of these companies sell these capsules with these thick enteric-coated capsules to help a little bit with the upset stomach, the burpy fishy taste, but they're not really taking the oil in the form that it's found in the fish, because you made a good point. There's no fish swimming around the ocean with ethyl alcohol in them, so why would we ever take a supplement that has alcohol in it? So there's another process. Start for me at that point, what the process is then to get it back to the triglyceride form.
Well, this is the final step, and it's the most time-consuming, it's the most expensive part of the process, but what this requires is about 4 to 6 months of removing the alcohol and reassembling the oil in the natural form. This is actually called a reesterified triglyceride. And interestingly, all the studies in terms of absorption and how well this form gets into the cells, it proves to be better than the original native oil form. So cleaning the oil, and that should make sense to the viewers, that once this oil is really pure as nature intended it to be, it gets right into the body. So this process is very expensive. And America is about commerce, and since it's all fish oil, this is where the confusion occurs. So this is the process that we follow at physician-recommended nutraceuticals. We would never want our patients, our doctors, to have anything other than the best possible form. And when we do that, we can reach a therapeutic level much more easily.
And I think that's so key what you just said, a therapeutic level, because we're taking these supplements to help with a disease process, to suppress inflammation. So just like if you take a therapeutic medicine, if you don't take enough, you're not going to get any results. So let me ask you this. How would a patient know that they're getting a triglyceride form omega-3 when they go to buy one?
The triglyceride manufacturers of fish oil will have that on the label. It'll say on the supplement fact sheet in TG form.
So what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to, while we're talking here, we'll put a label up and you can see that. So on the back of the label, correct me if I'm wrong, it'll say as TG or it'll say triglyceride form.
Correct.
So would our viewers be comfortable in knowing that if it don't say it, it ain't? Is that a good way?
That's a reasonable assumption,
So
Tom.
if they go to CVS and they pick up the label and it doesn't say TG or anything like that, it's not the TG form and they shouldn't be taking that.
That's correct.
And let's say they were going to take that. How many of those would they have to take to, let's say, equal one TG form omega-3?
Well, we've done a number of comparison studies in this regard. Probably somewhere between 20 and 30 a day.
And that stomach would never handle it. I mean, it would
never.
you'd never be able to do it and swallow all those pills. You just couldn't do it. So I think, you know, you made a point also that we're a commerce society, but I think we're also a value society, and we want the best. So we don't want to take 50 capsules when we could take 4 and get that therapeutic level without all of the side effects. And I think that's what has made physician-recommended nutraceuticals so successful, is that they supply a good product, and yes, it is a little bit more expensive, but if you were going to take 30 capsules a day of the other one, you're going to spend the same amount anyway, right? So it doesn't make sense to load your body up with that ethyl alcohol and all the impurities when you really should be taking something that it's in its purest form.
That's well said, and I think we can distill all of this down to a simple equation, which is if you take a therapeutic dose of something and you stay with it, you will get the desired therapeutic outcome. Well, for the first time in food science and nutritional science, we can actually say if you take a certain amount of omega-3s in the right form, in this case it would be 2 to 3 grams, and you take it for a reasonable amount of time. In fact, this is really a lifetime commitment. You will get that anti-inflammatory therapeutic outcome that you desire, and that's what your doctor is recommending, and that's what you're buying the product for.
And that's going to help with conditions such as arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, cardiovascular disease, helping to lower cholesterol, dry eye. I mean, those are all conditions that can be helped by this.
Bet. And every one of those conditions has itis at the end.
Exactly.
And that we are the anti-itis.
Now, we got about 1.5 to 2 minutes left here. The question I get all the time from patients, and I've actually had this discussion with cardiologists, so I need you to look into that camera and tell patients, do omega-3s cause excess bleeding? Because I've gotten into this argument with cardiologists, and they tell patients that if you're on a blood thinner, if you're on Coumadin, aspirin, Plavix, you cannot take omega-3s because it will thin your blood.
Absolutely, unequivocally no, with the caveat that it must be omega-3s in this form. When fish oil was originally discovered, when omega-3s were discovered, it was in populations like the Eskimos in Greenland who were eating nothing but fish, and the equivalent would be 15 grams a day of the essential EPA and DHA in the fish oil. Those are the omega-3s that do the job. There was no bleeding issues in these populations. In fact, no one worries. In fact, even the doctor never worries or tells a patient who's about to have surgery, for example, stop eating fish. So the problem and where this mythology came from were the forms of fish oil in these impure forms or in these chemical forms, because in those forms they could have an impact on the liver, they could have an impact on clotting, or they have other things in them like high amounts of vitamin E.
That's the biggie.
Right, which is used to preserve that impure oil or that partially rancid oil, and it's the high amount of vitamin E which actually causes the anticoagulation effect.
That's a great way to wrap up our show, Mike. I just want to review here, folks. Omega-3s, anti-inflammatory, high cholesterol, heart disease, arthritis. You should be taking omega-3s. They need to be in the natural triglyceride form, which is the physician-recommended nutraceutical form. And omega-3s in the triglyceride form do not have a negative impact on bleeding. It is some of the over-the-counter brands that have vitamin E added to them, that need to be added to them because they're so impure, that actually can promote problems with bleeding. So, folks, a lot of information. Again, if there's any questions, please feel free to give us a call, 453-2020. As a reminder, this is part one of a two-part show. We're going to have Dr. Gross back for our next show to talk a little bit more about omega-3 science and ocular health also. So again, Dr. Gross, thanks for joining us today. Again, thanks for joining us out there, folks. I'm Dr. Thomas Kislan. You've been watching Eyecare Today. We'll see you next time.